This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zhang. I'm a psychologist and a research assistant at University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Zach, and I'm a student studying psychology at University of Queensland.
And we today are making videos about each of the chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we're looking at Chapter 8, African Environmental Movements, Africans Saving Africa Themselves. And it's written by Faya Stein. And Dr. Stein is a lecturer in African history and African environmental history at the University of Stirling. Well, one of the points that the author makes in this chapter, which is a historical map of the movement and a kind of timeline looking across the many countries, is that the environmental movement has really been influenced, of course, like all of African history, by colonization and the dark forces of racism. So can you tell us a little bit about that part of the chapter, Andrea?
Yeah, sure. So the historical roots of most of the African environmental movements are really highly related with the conservation movement in the second half of the 19th centuries. And this is when the colonial government is trying to start a conservation plan that is to protect the wildlife against hunting. And the intention was said to be this, but really behind the reason is that the colonial government is claiming the land for themselves and also chasing the local community off the area and really exploiting the rich natural resources in that area. And this kind of political actions really is problematic because it led to the exclusion of the local community who lived there for centuries, and also they really depended on those resources for their life quality.
Yeah, and it was even the case that a lot of the movements to protect African natural resources and nature were being driven by environmentalists who were not even living on the continent. So the author talks about this movement or society rather that formed in 1903 in London. It's the Society for Protection of Wild Fauna of the Empire. So no matter how positive their intentions around biodiversity conservation, from the outside, the stark imperialist and racist agenda stands out. Another thing they talked about was how the environmental movement in South Africa, is so heavily imbued with its racism that the different environmental groups had to be formed for Black and white participants in line with their racist apartheid regime. This was one of many examples. In that section as well, there was a concept called fortress conservation, right? Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, so just linked to what you just said, these colonial conservation policy kind of set local people into enemies to them. And these policies are mostly supported by white Europeans. And the idea is to save Africa from African people. Then there is the term soil conservation, which is to the government is really want to protect the land from desertification. And
I'll just jump in, desertification. Yeah, so it's like the idea that the land is actually going to turn from pasture and farmland and forest into desert unless you take steps. So that's the idea of soil conservation. Please go on.
Yes. Yeah. And this policy really affected the life quality of local African people, because most of them really are heavily rely on farming, and most of them local people are farmers. And this policy also blamed Africans for these poor soil conditions, and they kind of initiate these betterment schemes in South America to remedy this situation, but really they ignore the fact that this over exploitation of resources is actually caused by the colonial land and those settlement policies.
Yeah, that's right. So overcrowding was often caused by people being pushed out of one area, forced to settle in another, and then that would impact on local farming practices. And they talk about how they had this coercive policing of local farmers, forcing them to do, backbreaking labor to build barriers so that the soil wouldn't blow away. And again, even though you might be supportive of the environmental policy, it's just hard to disentangle it from the blatant racism and unfair colonial practices.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, so there was one point where they wanted to create a gaming region, so to ensure that big game hunting, which was one of the ways that they earn money, could be maintained or sustained over time. So they had to zone out regions for tree farming and big game hunting, and on top of soil conservation. So regions of Africa had to be moved or reserved just for these kind of situations. So people that are living at these locations had to move out overnight. And if they do stay there or continue their practices, they can be charged with illegal measures.
Yeah. They criminalized like hunting and called it poaching overnight, like what Zach is saying. The practice that you use to feed your family becomes a crime. So that was part of the same dark history. Just looking at the next chapter, it's sort of the next part is after independence, more of the same. Tell us about that, Zach. What does the author mean by that?
It's more about the same because during that period, there's still a lot of political instability. So a lot of regions were fighting against each other. There was riots, protests to a certain extent, which prevented the development of environmental management. And so in combination with Africa's droughts and natural disasters, this led to multiple deaths due to food shortage and malnutrition. And adding on to the previous points, soil conservation also requires the culling of some animals in order to ensure some form of, I'm not sure exactly what's the point, but this led to a lot of lack of wild livestock. So there wasn't much of a growth in that aspect since they can't really sustain themselves. So they're too busy surviving.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that another factor in that that I think you both have touched on is an over-reliance on external experts as well to shape the environmental policy, so-called. So when the law was passed in 1968 to protect Africa's natural environment, it was literally drafted by Europeans working with the United Nations. And so that kind of policy centered in and around the understandings of people from outside the region never put the local people in the picture and was part of continuing practice of racism. And then in the next section, the author sort of talks about how things go from bad politically to bad ecologically and socially. And there's a description of the terrible droughts, starvation and famine, and the way that impacted on the communities and on the environmental movements. On the one hand, by setting them back because of the pressures that Zach alluded to, but on the other hand, by drawing in a lot of international organizations that started to connect with local communities and partner with them under the banner of sustainable development. Did one of you guys want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, sure. So since the 1980s, we really saw there is a development of community involvement in this natural conservation, and not just like it is the direct opposite of what we just mentioned about setting local community as enemies of the natural conservation. Instead, the government finally realized there should be an input from the local community, and so they collaborate with them and make the local community accountable to conduct natural conservation in their living area, and also make it possible for the local community to benefit directly from the tourists that visited this area. And this is considered such a successful policy, as the local people are more professional as they live there for centuries. So they are more professional in knowing how to preserve the area and to profit from the area with a more environmentally friendly way. And it is very different from the concept we just mentioned, that is the local communities was the enemy of the conservation, and now they are kind of become the master of this area, and they benefited and also protected the environmental resource in this area.
Yeah, and there's another positive development, wasn't there, when some of the international NGOs encountered and engaged the problem of toxic waste dumping. Does one of you folks want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the other very important environmental issues is about like toxic waste dumping that is from the foreign companies that was like practicing like waste dumping in Africa. And it is a very serious issue since there is, because it is really widespread and also project a very negative consequence on the local environment.
So in this kind of system, foreign companies literally would bring waste, toxic chemical waste from Europe and dump it in African villages and communities and on farmlands by paying the local people a pittance. And what I understood from the chapter is that Greenpeace and other NGOs led a broad coalition that helped African states to pass regulation on this, and then eventually for some African states to entirely ban the practice. So it may seem like a low-hanging fruit, but it was actually, as Andrea is saying, something that stopped poisons from being dumped into waterways and having lasting implications for local communities' health. So that was a real win. But also it involved, as we're talking about, a more respectful relationship of empowering local communities and states to act rather than, trying to jump in and create exclusionary zones. After the Cold War, things changed again, didn't they? How did that happen?
So previously, there was a group of environmentalist activists that managed to force the South African government to suspend the annual sea harvesting. So,
yeah,
they managed to force the chemicals to cease operating in the country. Tall Chemicals, which is another group that also dumped their waste in Africa.
Yeah.
And they also managed to prevent them from continuing their practices. So they also cooperated with other, I think, outside sources to also get the necessary evidence to show that this multinational company was one of the major polluters in South Africa. So the problem with the pollutants was that even though it started really early and that everyone knows is a bad thing, the practice only ceased in 1998. So it lasted for a very long time, even though a lot of communities managed to rally up and say, yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, and I believe it still continues in some countries, even though the laws are against it. But the communities find that the companies can ignore the laws and sometimes act with impunity, without being punished. I was saying after the Cold War, there was also a change in the character of the environment movement with many, many thousands of new groups forming. I don't know if either of you guys was prepared to talk about that or if that was supposed to be on my list. I'm happy to talk about it. The context here was that, the Cold War between Russia and the United States resulted in each side propping up lots of dictatorships. And after that foreign money was withdrawn, democracies formed all across the continent. And it really opened up the space for civil society to emerge, and tens of thousands of new NGOs, according to the author, hit the scene. The other part was this ideology of sustainable development in partnership with local communities, where international development organizations and foreign governments and charities all wanted to work with local NGO partners in order to have a more respectful relationship. And so that really led to a greater focus on partnering with African NGOs. And the other factor was the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, which was the first steps towards trying to establish international treaties and accords, which were going to create a context for action on climate change. And so with the international NGOs increasing awareness and embrace of justice issues and increasing respect for local communities, there was more opportunity for civil society in Africa to form and contribute. But that's not to neglect the ongoing injustices and concerns with dictatorships and repressive regimes. All over the continent, sometimes groups can be repressed still and prevented from acting. And one well-known story is that of the Ogoni region in Nigeria, where a local minority ethnic group was denied access to the money from oil and prevented from having autonomy over their development in their region, and prevented from acting, or there was a failure to act by the state in the face of toxic oil spills. And so Ken Saro-Wiwa and others led a movement for autonomy and control and respect. And although they did win some local autonomy, he and a number of others were executed on false pretenses by the state. And then corporations kind of continued to rule with impunity. But one positive aspect that the author says came out of this is that the concept of corporate social responsibility was actually formed in that campaign, that companies would, or spread through that campaign, that companies should be held accountable for human rights abuses and environmental pollution that's happening overseas in their name. And that's something that continues to be an important part of the environmental movement today. There was also a discussion in this context of how the diversity of local groups needs to be recognized, where there's like local groups that are acting for local concerns, like we just talked about. And then there's local branches of national and regional groups, and even of international organizations. And then there's alliances and federations that have now formed, like the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance now includes over 1,000 organizations in 48 countries. One person we haven't talked about, who's actually featured at length in the chapter, is a Kenyan activist who won the Nobel Prize in 2004, and who launched an important tree planting project. Her name is Wangari Maathai. And I don't know if either of you had it on your list to talk about Wangari, or should I talk about her? I'm going to go for it. So this tree planting project in Kenya was reacting to the same concerns of soil conservation that we've talked about. But unlike being imposed from above with disregard for farmers, this was a huge movement which empowered tens of thousands of rural women to promote tree planting and agroforestry. And it was supported by numerous international NGOs, along with the United Nations Environmental Program and the Kenyan state. But by after decades of the project, millions of trees had been planted, and this project is credited with slowing the desertification and preserving the land through millions of acres. So it's an important example of how effective civil society can be. I guess when I think about this chapter, I think that it is a history of the African environmental movement. I knew almost little about it, like very little about it, almost nothing. And so I appreciate the opportunity to learn a lot about this region of the world and the important steps that have been taken. What about you guys? Do you have a take-home point or message from the chapter?
Yes, so it is a really good example that you just bring up, the Green Belt movement. And I just feel like this is an example of like how good a combination of empowering the local people and also let them protect their local community, their local environment could be such an effective solution to Africa environmental issues. And what I really enjoy from this chapter is there is a clear timeline that the environmental movement in Africa starts small and they are quite diverse, but they kind of grow gradually and they survive from the historical inequalities from the colonial government and also survive the economic crisis that was in the 1970s.
Yeah, and the ecological crisis of the 80s. It's
Yes.
really been a story of resilience and strength.
Yes. So I feel like because of the diversity of countries in this Africa area, I feel like it is very important to focus on environmental movements in related to the economical like needs from the local communities to let them benefit directly from their natural resources and really let them have the say on how to prevent these natural resources. We need the knowledge from the local people, and also we need them to consult them and also let them become a part of the member when we are like just establishing the environmental friendly policy.
Yeah, I think that it's really a story of failure and injustice when that doesn't happen. And that's something the chapter brings out. What about you, Zach? What did you take off from the chapter?
Well, I won't build on what happened in the past, but from what you heard just now from Andrea, Africa was basically ruled over or colonized for a long period of time. So there was a lot of inequalities and it suffered for a long time. But because of advancements in technology alongside building with the local community, so over the past 30 years, yes, significantly reduced historic inequalities in their situation. And also development of social media also helped to bring knowledge to that Africa suffered such injustice in the past and that they can receive assistance in terms of financial aid or aid in terms of food. So now the activists also are able to reach out to more of the local communities. So it's
that's a really good point.
It's time for them to get back.
Yeah. At the end of the chapter, there's a little discussion of the contemporary youth at the leadership of the African environmental movement. And like Zach's saying, how they're connected in with Fridays for Future and have been part of the protests with Greta Thunberg and others looking at, how to mobilize on climate change and use the internet for that. That's a really good point. Well, maybe we'll finish on that inspiring note. And I'll say thank you to Andrea and Zach for being here today and helping with the recording. And thank you to our viewers if you've stayed with us to the end. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ. And check out our website for more videos.